we have a truly inspiring guest with us today, someone who is at the forefront of revolutionizing the way startups access capital and grow their business. Our guest today, Mr. Swarandeep Singh, is not your typical investor. He is a visionary leader who's passionate about democratizing the way startups access financing. Swaran, you joined the leadership team of Recur, a venture fund that offers an innovative approach to startup financing, allowing founders to raise growth capital without giving up equity in 2022. And apart from your role at Recur Club, you're also the founder and managing partner of Likey Capital, an early stage sector agnostic investment fund, and you're also a venture capital scout with Sison Capital. Your diverse background has included work in sustainable finance, venture capital, extensive experience in supporting social ventures. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, Priyanshi. Thanks for having me.
So, to begin with, can you tell us a bit more about your journey from being an early investor to joining Record Club's leadership team today?
Sure, sure. So I started my venture journey in 2015, where I joined the Madrid-based Exxon Partners Group, which was a group company, not just doing venture capital investment, but also doing tech and telecom consulting specifically, and also a mid-size M&A iBank. So from there, I had spent a reasonable amount of time in that space, and what something that I wanted as an aspiration or as a personal development agenda for myself was learning the operating side, or like how do you operate. In investing, you invest into companies, but you are still sitting on the sidelines while you are talking to those companies and founders regularly, but you are not in the core of the action. So that's something that I wanted personally, because I have a view that people who are either operators or founders, or ex-founders or ex-operators, they make better investors because they are able to relate with the challenges and problems that founder is facing, and also able to help them navigate that. Since I had done enough of investing, and that's something that I actually continue to do, I wanted to be on the other side, where like how do you build teams from scratch and being part of 0 to 1 journeys. And my prior background of having done deals and investment, that is something that I felt was very relevant to what Recur Club was doing, where I invested in the seed round in September, October 2021, and I had seen their journey for almost a year before I decided that I can take an operating role, and specifically given my background, more to do with partnership, because that is an essential part of how we work with startups, which is of course doing directly reaching out and working with them, but also working with venture fund, because what we feel is that the non-dilutive capital or debt capital that we do is not something that is trying to replace equity, but is complementary to equity. So that's where we work extensively with a lot of investors, which includes incubators, syndicates, micro VCs, and VCs, to help them and their portfolio companies. So yeah, that's how I thought of moving on, and what I do at Recur.
So, like your diverse background in financing of different kinds, how is it helping your operational role at Record today? And what do you actually do here?
Sure. So I think those different or varied background helps me connect the dots from different, say, sectors, subsectors, industries that I've been part of, and of course, since we are sector agnostic, we are more concerned with the business model and how a company makes revenue and its cash flows, and less on the sector. So, given that I have spent time, and is also something that is desperately the need of the hour, which is like EV/ climate financing, or more broader sustainable financing. That as we are looking to transform a lot of our system that exists, that includes food and transformation, mobility, logistics, as we are trying to green them or make them more sustainable. I think that background helps me a lot connect and understand what the founders are trying to do. So of course, at Recur, capital is just the starting point. We do a bunch of other things which are complementary to capital, which is like helping them say get into equity, not directly via us, because that is something that we don't do ourselves, but that helping them bridge that connection to equity funds and equity investors. Then also, like a lot of these companies, when they're in early stages, a lot a big part of their expenses is on the cloud, whether it is AWS, Amazon. So how not just the cloud part, of course, that forms a bigger part of their expenses, but also other smaller, say, subscription tools that they would need. So we typically give them about 500K worth of credits of across all these standard technology providers and tools that you would see. Then a lot of companies that have taken capital from us already, we help them sell their solution, product, or service within our portfolio itself. So, like those are two major things that we do beyond just capital. But then we are also coming up with different technical tech tools, given that we are a tech first company, on how early stage companies which typically do not have a CFO or a finance function built in already, how can they automate it or in a more DIY format be able to access see the metrics that their business metrics, and how are they doing vis-a-vis their say subsector competitors or more on the sector. So if I'm a D2C brand doing say BPC, beauty and personal care, whether I'm doing better than others in the market specifically to BPC, and then more broadly on the D2C segment, how are my say metrics, whether it is say my LTV to CAC, my ROAS, return on advertising spend, gross margin percentages, like whatever you are able to select, it's a more of a founder friendly drag and drop kind of system. Whatever metrics you put, because it is we are collecting data from other companies, while we cannot share say which specific company is it, but we anonymize it on a sector and subsector level to give you insight specifically and how you can say improve on that. So there take tools like that. That's where or that's how we are helping. Um, but prior background of say specifically say sustainability related companies or other sector that I worked in helps you understand, connect, and understand the challenges that are there, and see on how starting from capital point of view can start solving those challenges.
Actually, on that note, can you tell us a bit more about your sustainable finance experience? And like you have developed some of the most innovative investment solutions for sustainable food systems. How is that? How did you help?
Sure. So, while we talk a lot about, say, transforming our existing systems, whether it is a food or logistics, mobility, as I was mentioning earlier, but a lot of money is needed to be able to transform those systems, and only government or public sources cannot do that. Of course, both public and private systems have to come together, and even then, there might be deficit on the kind of capital that we need to finance the exact transformation. So my role specifically in sustainable finance was that, and our sector was more limited. So we had food and agri as our main core sector, and then things which are more aligned to that. So food and agri would have water and land because they are two essential parts of food and agri on how you develop your crops. So that became our say outside the core, but still very important to food and agri. And then there were two cross-cutting sectors or themes, which one is gender, the second one being climate. So there are like five SDGs per se out of the 17 that exist. And what we were trying to do with four major stakeholders. One was impact funds, second was multilaterals like IFC, World Bank, and other such UN bodies. The third one more of Fortune 500 companies, and fourth were more of governments and foundations, which form a core part of any transformation that is needed. The reason being that as you want to build more formal capital systems, you end up creating like vehicles, whether it is a AIF, alternative investment funds, or a venture capital fund, or an innovation fund. Uh, it can take different forms and shape, but what essential is that agriculture in itself it's considered a very very risky sector because we know say climate, weather, uh, the current climatic conditions that are getting affected has a big role on the yield and what the farmers will be able to produce and sell. As a result, private sector typically wants to shy away from participating in that sector on the extent that it should. So what government and foundation started doing is that, say for example, 100 million fund is being institutionalized or conceptualized. The first tranche is something that they would want to take loss if a loss occurs in the fund. So that is what you call typically first loss tranche, or in some cases also referred as FLD, the first loss default guarantee. That
Mm-hmm.
unless I give them a buffer or a cushion that hey, if a loss happens in the fund, if our investment goes bad, as a foundation or as a government, I am ready to take that loss. And why a foundation or a government would do that? That if they don't come up with that first 10, 15, 20 million, the rest 70 or 80 million will never flow into the fund. So they take that as a buffer or a cushion. So that's what you typically call as blended finance. That you are trying to blend two things. The one sector is something that they consider very, like private sector considers this segment very risky, and public sector has to make sure that there is that this sectors get catalyzed or this transformation gets catalyzed. So they play the role of taking the first loss so that private capital can flow in. And the private capital is typically much larger than the public capital, specifically in this kind of system. So that first 10-20% can be that first loss, and rest 80% or rest 80 million in this case typically would come from the private capital. So that was the first thing that we were doing. And of course, this is something that has been conceptually, theoretically there from a very, very long time. But what ends up missing is, even though impact funds get created, they are truly never impact fund. They are more of financial first, impact second, or impact secondary fund. So what they would mean that they would mostly still look at investments the way a typical commercial hardcore VC would look at, but then they would keep impact as one of the major criteria in the investment that they're doing. Versus the other approach, which is that you are looking at impact first, that what impact would they do, and then you are looking at financial returns. Because unless that impact first lens is adopted, a lot of things still get neglected, which are very, very important. For example, if you take the case of, say, smallholder farmers, and smallholder farmers are typically, now, of course, the benchmark would vary a little bit on the geography, but typically any farmer who owns more less than 2 hectares of land. Uh, these are people like, if you add all the smallholder farmers across the world, they produce 70% of the food that we eat. But their contribution or the kind of capital that flows to them in different forms. Of course, we are not directly supplying capital to the farmer, but whatever, say, non-profits, for-profit startup that you would see, who are directly working with them, they get neglected because they are like individual on an individual basis. They have a very small influence or a share in the impact that it will create. While the large holder farmers, which have more than 2 hectares land, they get most of the attention, and that's where you also see. Say, if you look at agri-tech in India, last few years we have seen tremendous progress. But even then, most of those agri-tech solutions are working with farmers who are based in, say, either metro or mostly tier one cities. If you look at more of rural consumption or more of, say, what you call urban rural population, that is something that gets significant or disproportionate amount of capital, disproportionate amount of attention from the relevant stakeholders. So what we started doing is, one, build this blended finance structure. Second, work with them to make sure that it is more of impact first, finance secondary, or finance as like outside the core. Because unless that happens, you would never see that kind of transformation that you need to make sure that either we reach sustainable development goals by 2030, or we are very close to that. So that's what a like mindset shift was required. The third is that if you look at even funds that are working in that space, from, say, from the time that impact investment as a term started getting coined, was that they would more of business focused funds, or the individuals who are driving those funds are more focused on business. Is this business viable? Is this business good enough? But what they would typically lack is that in these sectors, a lot of science goes behind agriculture, the soil, the water content, the kind of crop that you need, the kind of geographies where you can do that. So the science part was always missing. So their investment thesis was never science-based thesis. It was more of business or commerce-based thesis. That, hey, this sector, this particular product has this much margin, this much. But they would never look at science and what data says historically, and also the projected data that you can get based on the, say, scientific studies that are going on in different parts of the world. So what our team started doing was more focused on the data that we already have from the last few years that we were in operations, plus then look at projected data to inform funds, and and co-develop an investment thesis with them. That, hey, while your business sense or your business acumen would say something else, but the science part of it would say something else. For example, we would be able to build models on how climate change and whatever, say, degree the temperature would rise, what effect it would have on the yield, what effect the soil conditions and the moisture and the water content in those would affect the yield, and eventually, since the farmer's yield is getting affected, the kind of services product that you are rendering to them also gets affected, because his or her income potential, or revenues and those things get affected. So more on a second order effect, that let's look at data and science on what these input parameters would do, which would impact the farmer, and hence your startup and hence your investment that you are doing. So more build on the science based thing. So these are three major things that we started doing, which we felt were missing, and it was more of impact second investments, more of business based, and then private sector not participating at all. So we made sure that there was enough incentive or enough cushion or buffer for them, so that they can also participate in a sector as risky as agriculture.
I see. So, with impact investing, financing or profitability is actually a core pillar of making sure that sustainable development goals are achieved. And we have seen this with a lot of impact investors that they are indeed inclined towards specific sectors and, as you said, shying away from such risky alternatives. So, how did you manage that buffer? And more so, over what advice would you give to startups in this field so that they can align their missions with sustainable development goals and also attract such impact investors?
Sure. So I think a key part of getting that buffer was to be able to find investors who were aligned with that mission, and that would largely be public money. So that public money could be from governments, it could be from foundations, or any such stakeholder that you would be able to. It could be a multilateral as well, that is willing to take that risk or that bet. That unless I step forward, there would no one else would come forward and put money behind such. So I think the key part for developing that buffer was to be able to identify those, and then be able to convince them of a fund uh, where they would take that risk or that loss, and then that fund was also aligned to what they typically would want to go behind. So typically, as you see, foundations do a lot of grants, and of course they have a certain thesis on the grants as well, on what kind of sector they would focus on, what kind of sector they would focus on, whether it is say rural versus urban. So whatever parameters they would have, you would have to develop your fund based on that, and then they would be able to participate in that, as long as they're convinced of the say the team that is running that fund, the thesis that they have, and all those typical due diligence process that you would follow while making any commitment to any fund. But what we made sure that we were able to get a pool of such people, such institutions that would come and back such funds. So that was like number one. I think the second part was that even Fortune 500 companies who were working in this space of food and agri specifically, they also wanted their supply chains to become sustainable, because of course they have a pressure from their own board that it's not just that they have to become sustainable. Whatever stakeholder that they touch also has to follow or become on that path eventually, sooner than later. So they also had an incentive where they wanted to make sure that, say, maybe the vendors that they have or the supply chain that they have does not have that kind of incentive to do that, but that's where they stepped in and said, hey, I want to make sure my supply chain is sustainable. They are following the best practices that you would do. So I am willing to work with you to develop a strategy on each and every part of my supply chain. How can they themselves become sustainable, climate neutral, or maybe climate positive, depending on, of course, depending on what they would want to achieve from that. And then I'm willing to put money and capital behind it as well. It's not just that I want, because of course those vendors, that supply chain stakeholder, do not have that financial capability. They're small vendors who are supplying say certain raw materials or certain intermediate products, or in some cases also finished products to these industries. So how can each of those participants or stakeholders in my supply chain become sustainable? I think that became an important part of our work as well.
I
And
see.
third, on a very, very large scale perspective, it becomes the multilaterals. Because multilaterals are funding a large part of, say, big, big scale projects that you would see in different developing countries and emerging economies. So until and unless they're also aligned, and the capital that they're putting behind projects is also aligning to that mission or to that goals for 2030, the entire system will not come about. So you needed a more of a system change, and for system change, you wanted every stakeholder that is participating in that to start following that approach sooner than later. Of course, it is a gradual process. It's not that overnight this will happen, but then you build a strategy on in the first phase. What would you do? and once that results or that pilot is successful, then you will move to stage two. And then once you do it with a few projects, you will start replicating it across projects and across geographies where they're investing. So that became a key part of that. I think the second part of your question was more around what founders can do. I think there are a lot of innovation funds that are typically, so there are a category called innovation funds. In some cases, they're also called as grant based funds. Again, it has very different kind of sub segments within that. So uh, there is a financing mechanism which is called results for development, that you show results, and based on the results you'll get development financing aids. So the entire piece which comes before any institutional investor on the venture capital side can come in, specifically in sectors which are more related or more aligned to sustainable development goals, and also the kind of solution that you're offering or the service that you're offering. They should be able to think about accessing those as well, because largely what I see, everybody would want to go with angel investors or institutional investors, but also they also have their own mandates and what they can do, what they cannot do. So for more risky experiments, more grant-based capital, results for development kind of financing, there are enough players out in the market. It's just that it's not very easy to discover and access them. So discovery part, a lot of players within the global ecosystem are trying to solve, where they are able to help you identify, hey, which all sectors and which all themes this particular say foundation or a funder is willing to take a bet on, or like put money behind. So the key is to kind of be able to discover them and then see if what they would want, what they typically fund based on the history, based on what you would see previously, is matching with what they are doing. Of course, it is more slower in nature given that it is largely public money, a lot of multilateral foundations are involved, so slightly more also bureaucratic. But then they just don't help you with capital, but given the skill that they say public institutions, foundations are involved, they also help you in getting that first say pilots, first kind of client that can potentially be there. So it's not just softer uh, capital, it's not just the hard money capital, it's also software capital that you would typically need as you are building a solution which is more to do with sustainability, and which means might not have that commercial viability right now. It might come because unless it does not come, of course, as a for-profit venture, your sustenance is under question. But they might not have achieved that commercial viability right now. So you need certain capital and certain stakeholders to come in, and getting or finding those becomes an important task for founders that are building in this sustainability or green finance, green space.
Being sector agnostic has its own challenges. How do
Right.
you weigh A versus B, which is not even comparable? So, what kind of a calculator or system do you use, both with impact investing or with Recur today, to see if a startup has potential, and even if it belongs to different sectors, which one would you choose to fund?
Think yes, definitely it has its own challenges and it has its own benefits as well. So I think on the challenge part, if you are sector agnostic, it is difficult to typically build typically build depth in the kind of sector knowledge, sector expertise that you have. So that is a like a very obvious challenge that you have. But it also depends on the stage that you are working with. If you are early stage, typically you are in a way betting on people or betting on a single or a team of founders that they would be able to identify, solve this problem, and you can't pick and choose on which sector's problem you would focus and not the others. So either you define what stage you would do. So if you are going more later stage where somebody has already figured out the problem that they want to solve, they have figured out a product market fit, a lot of that sector knowledge that you are applying, it becomes more relevant. But when you are in very early stages, typically you need hand holding with the very small and basic things. And then how do I build my business model, how do I hire right? So they are becoming sector agnostic, specifically in a sector like or related to UN sustainable development goals, becomes very tough. Specifically with Unleashed, that was the case. When it comes to say Recur Club, uh, there we have a clear sector preference, I would say, or more of a business model preference rather than sector. Given that we are providing non-dilutive capital or debt capital to startups, we would also want that to come back, because lending is always easy, collections is always tough. Similarly, on the investing equity side, investing is easy, getting exits is tough. So given the nature of this, uh, we typically focus more on companies which have more sticky nature of revenues or more subscription based revenues. So that's a clear preference, and that's also reflected in our portfolio likewise. So there we are a bit choosy. We would not go after every sector, but more of the business model. If the business model can demonstrate this sticky nature of revenue, sticky nature of cash flows, we would be able to do that. If we feel there is a sector or if there is a company which there is no predictability of revenues, because we are also doing early stage there as well. While we have two parts, so we have early stage solution and we have a late stage solution. But on the early stage, we still are in that early stage risk, where is that the company might need to pivot, they might not be able to find the product market fit. So you have to like do a trade off, and the trade off in our case is more on the business model and the nature of the revenue. So that is one clear preference. The second one is that we look at more of contracted if there is no subscription revenue, which means that you have contracts which are more short to medium term. So anywhere from say 3 months to maybe 12 months, 18 months contracts. But their contract do not have a absolute guarantee built in into that they would be renewed. So it's not like a subscription revenue, but more on contracted. The third is more where you have neither. You are going more on predictability, that based on the business, based on previous trends, based on the data that you have of the orders that you have sold or the products that you have sold, you are able to forecast it or extrapolate it. So there would be only certain business models which would feed, which will like fit with these three criteria of subscription, contracted, or predictable. A lot of other sectors typically get out of the picture. So there we have a, I would say, a preference. While we don't reject any company just based on the sector, we look at more of the business and the business model that they have, and is the revenue sticky? Is the concentration not that great that if one particular client would leave, would their business entirely would become questionable? Say if a client is giving them 60% of their revenues, if that client leaves, would they be under a significant trouble? So we look at all of those things, which means that we are not sector focused but more on business model focused and revenue based focus on how the revenues come in.
That's very helpful to know. So there is no B2B or B2C preference.
So I would say preference, but not exclusion. That just because somebody is B2C, we would reject them, or just because in B2C you can also have subscriptions. So
Mhm.
it could be a subscription bid, but I am not selling to businesses. I'm selling to individuals. So take say example Notion. Notion is
Mhm.
a consumer SaaS. They sell both, or they are both B2B and B2C SaaS, which means they are also selling to individuals. So just because they are selling to consumers, we would not reject them, or any other such business, we would not reject them that hey, we would not fund because you're B2C.
I
It
see.
would depend more on the business model or how they make their revenues,
Or how
whether they
sticky
do,
that revenue is.
how sticky the and how sticky that revenue is.
Makes sense. So, talking a bit more about Recur, it offers an innovative approach to financing through revenue exchange. Can you
Right.
explain how that works and how does it help startup founders?
Sure. So there are multiple benefits that the founders are, but I will go more on explaining how it happens. Is that say any company is making $100 revenue every month, and they would typically wait every month to get that $100. What we essentially do is that we ask them, hey, why do you wait for the entire year to get $1,200? We would apply a certain rate, or a discounting rate or a factor, and we would discount that $1,200 today, give you that upfront to use, so that you can spend it on things that you actually care about or need today, and not by the end of the year or not by the mid of the year. And what you have to do is that as that subscription revenue keeps flowing to you every month, you pass that back to us till whatever amount you have taken. So in a way, I'm able to upfront my revenues that I would receive in the future today.
I
And
see.
essentially, what that happens is that you still need a, not a collateral, but like a backing on how that revenue would flow in. So as a part of that, typically they have to attach their contracts or revenue, like subscription or their contracts as part of that. It's not a collateral; it acts as a proxy collateral. That hey, I know that there is revenue coming in. I have listed my few contracts, and in case the startup is not able to pay, then I have a right to assign, which means that the revenues or the cash flows coming via those contracts, I'm able to advance it to myself to get those recovery or to get those repayments. And if say any of those starts defaulting, those contracts are defaulting, then I have a right to come to the second one or to the third one. So you have a cash flow backed or a revenue backed capital way on how you can do that. How is it beneficial to startup and startup founders is that one, I don't need to be dependent on VC money. That I can grow at my own pace, because once you start taking venture capital, of course there are certain assumptions, expectations are expected out of a founder and the company, that they would grow at a certain rate, they would have to hit certain milestones, benchmarks in a certain period of time. Not all businesses and not all founders are built that way or they are comfortable that way. So this allows them to build at their own pace. That is number one. Number two, without diluting equity, I have a right to raise capital and I can actually use that capital to grow. Uh, the third is that, like, for risky experiments where I don't know the outcome of that experiment or the thesis that I have or the experiment that I'm doing as part of early stage, figuring out my product market fit, figuring out what my business model should look like, I should be able. I should be using equity because I don't know what those metrics, what those output would look like, outcome would look like. But for things where I have already established that if I invest X rupees, I get Y rupees. So what you typically call as return on that channel, return on that advertisement. Like in case of advertisement, you refer that metrics at ROAS, return on advertising spent. Once I'm able to establish that, where I know that putting X I get Y and Y is greater than X, even after I deduct my financing cost, like interest cost, I know I'm still like contributing to my one top line and also my bottom line. I should be deploying that debt capital for those for those experiments, for those activities, because I know the outcome is there and I have that ability to serve that debt that is there. And in any company, if you go to typical corporate finance 101, there is always the right equity debt mix in any company. You look at all public companies, all of them use debt capital. It's not that they don't use it. Like every company typically looks at it. Of course, debt has to be used very carefully, because if not used carefully, then it has its own ramifications where it starts compounding. You start incurring penalties if you are breaching covenants. But if you use right, it has so many benefits, which is accretive to your equity, which means that because I'm able to do more business, because I'm able to earn more profit based on the non-dilutive that I'm raising, my business will be valued much more because of the revenue, because of the multiple, because of margins and whatever I'm being able to do. So in a way, it is adding to your equity. You're not diluting that much. You are growing at your own terms, and more importantly, if you look at traditional financial institutions, at least in India, they're still not comfortable with this concept of early stage startups burning money. They have never given money to such startup, or even if they have, that is very, very limited to a certain ticket size, which is typically early 20, 30 lakhs. Uh, Companies which have become more scalable, they have already attracted institutional investors, they've already raised Series B, then they still start coming in. Even though those companies are burning money, but in the early stages, when the company is burning money, no institutional investor has come in, or very small amount of capital has flown in, the financial institutions typically don't come in. That's where we fill the gap. That we know that you're burning money. We know that you have a certain runway in your company based on what you are burning. So we will be able to finance you up to that runway. Because of course we also have to make sure that our risks are well covered. Given that whatever money that we are advancing, also third party money, like NBFCs that we partner with or the other lenders that we partner with, are deploying that capital. So we have to do our own due diligence, which means we cannot fulfill every company's need, but whatever company's need we are able to fulfill, they have very good use cases on how it has helped them, one, raise capital externally if they had to raise equity, and if they never wanted to raise, they never had any option. So services business would never get any equity capital because that does not fit in the kind of businesses or the growth the equity investors look at. So they never had that option, and suddenly with last few years with this new alternative financing or modern age financing instruments or asset classes that has come in, they are able to do that. And of course, we are not the only one. There are other leasing parameters. There are invoice discounting. There are a bunch of other things. But yeah, we focus more on recurring revenue and how do you use that as a financing mechanism via kind of an exchange where somebody is looking at that future revenue and giving that upfront money so that you can pay them back as the time comes and as the duration comes.
So that's where the name comes from.
Yeah.
Help our startup founders understand when is equity versus debt a good option because both of them coexist. So how should they choose?
I think I would take a different approach on answering this because typically what founders or any business plan does is that it maps capital. It does not map it to the end users, like end use of the capital and also the source of that capital. So we treat every capital is the same. While fundamentally, if you look at finance, it is not the same. Like different sources of capital have their own use cases or their own sources on how they're coming in. So depending how your business model is structured, how your say next 18 months look like, or your say whatever 24 months look like, if you are able to map it on how much do I need for what use case or what end objective that I want to use, you can also do that reverse calculation on how much of capital do I need to raise as equity, how much as grant, how much if a grant capital is available, how much of it is debt, and debt also depending on the risky nature because is not one single source. Debt also has multiple products. So you have term loans, you have CCODs, you have recurring revenue financing, you have lease financing. So depending on your use case, you have to allocate how much capital do I need overall for what use case, and for specific use case, how do I finance that capital? Does that capital need to come from equity? Does it need to come from grant? Does it need to come from debt? And within debt, what kind of instrument does it need to come from? Because every debt product or every non-equity product has a specific characteristic, has a specific term, has a specific way on how it will get financed. So if you are able to do that matching exercise, your source and your end use, then you will never face a problem in calculating on how much do I raise as equity or how much do I raise as debt. I think the main challenge is that we treat every capital as same, which is or as uniform, which is not the case.
I see. Do you have like any example from your portfolio who has used such a good approach of mixing the two and identifying the source?
Yes, yes. I think even before I joined Recur, I had about if I remember correctly, three companies where either I or somebody else has had put in equity capital, and they didn't want to raise equity capital again, uh, given the nature on what they wanted to use. So, for example, that this company that I'm talking about, they are more of a Shopify for travel agents, and they had to pay their travel agents while the end user will take its own credit cycle to pay them back. So, because there is a mismatch between your assets and liabilities, or the time when your assets and liabilities are coming in, you have to finance that. So, for that, they started using non dilutive capital from Recur to be able to bridge that hole or bridge that gap. So, depending on what your use case is, you will be able to figure out what is the right instrument, right product that I should use to fill this gap. And of course, it comes more with awareness, more with education. Like of course, this all these products or all these asset classes, instruments are still very new. Maybe CCOD term loans have been existing for a while, but this invoice discounting, lease finance, at least formally in the startup sector, there was not that prominent. Of course, in traditional businesses, uh, typical industries, it was still there, but when you talk about startup, these things did not exist maybe 3 5 years back. So a lot of founders and even investors are getting accustomed to how they should help their portfolio companies from which sources, and that how much of that capital should be sourced from that part. So I think I give you a use case, but that can be extrapolated to many such other use cases as well.
Makes sense. So, what are the future plans and initiatives of Recur? Are there any new features or offerings in the pipeline that founders should know about?
So I think there were two recent things that we did. Earlier, we were focused more on the early stage part, where we able to finance, I think, more or less on a benchmark. I would say Series A companies. But given that we were getting a lot of bigger companies, more scalable companies, we have started uh, higher ticket financing as well, which So before this, it used to stop at 10 cr, that our ticket size could not go beyond 10 cr given the kind of companies we were catering to. But now we have a product which caters at, of course, at much lower interest rate as well, from 10 cr to 100 cr kind of a ticket size. So that is something that we have started. I think more on the sustainable finance, because that is some a sector that we saw prominently in our portfolio at Recur as well, which was more on EV companies, more of clean tech companies, more of companies which are doing logistics but on a greening side. So we started a specific facility, and facility is like a capital that you typically earmark for a specific, say, initiative or for a certain use case. That this will go only in that particular sector or that particular use case. So we launched something called a Regreen Fund, which is only for green companies, which would include your climate, EV, mobility, uh, and other sectors that are part of the SDGs. As long as they fit that framework, we are able to finance them. So we have earmarked like a capital facility just to for that. So I think these are two major things that we have started doing, and we will like typically build on that as things move forward.
That's so good to hear. It looks like you're bringing in your past experience and
Yeah.
building new features at Recur which echo that vision. So,
Yep.
last question for startup founders considering Recur, what key things should they keep in mind? How should they approach you? And what is their best bet to get financing from you?
Yeah, I think something I would say something which is very counterintuitive, as because we see those things very in and out. That typically when somebody a founder has raised equity capital, they are no, I have already raised equity, I don't need any capital. But actually, if you look at it, that's the best time to raise, because you have money in your bank, you have just raised a round. Uh, any debt provider would be very very comfortable to give you equity, because they know that that money has just hit your account. But what most founders end up doing is, when their equity capital is almost dried up or almost drying out, they approach to raise debt at the time. And unfortunately, because every investor or every lender, like lender would be a more appropriate term, so every lender, when he or she looks at it, that it's only 2 months of cash that the company has now, that's a time when they are not able to give you. So I think the best time to raise non-dilutive capital, debt capital, is when you have just raised the equity round. You already have money in the bank, which you can use for later purposes, when what you typically call as a rainy day, when maybe things are not going your way, you're doing a pivots, or you maybe have to like buy out time. Uh, but given that they just raised, they say no, we are not interested because we already have capital. But the key part missing, which I mentioned earlier, is that you're not mapping your end use of capital with the source of capital. So yes, it's great that you've raised equity, and we are not trying to replace it at all. What we are trying to do is complement that. So maybe you are spending money on, say, social media ads, or maybe certain, say, expenses that you are doing, which is not necessarily that you do with equity capital. Maybe you raise debt, non-dilutive capital, and use it for that. Your
Yes.
equity capital can go for doing risky experiments or taking bets which you don't know would work out or not. So I think that is one message that I would want founders to leave with, which is raise capital, raise non-dilutive capital or debt capital at a time when you're flush with money, because that's the easiest time any debt provider or any lender would give you money. Or maybe somewhere in the middle, but not towards the end when you're already like used most of your capital. You just have 2 months of runway left. You are burning 10 lakhs a month, and you just have 25 or 30 lakhs left. Which, so I think that is something that I would want to leave the audience with.